So, we've covered a lot of DAWs here on my channel, but none of them are quite like this one. When this topic was first recommended to me by one of my Discord members, I had never even heard of it, and I'd consider myself to be fairly deep into the music production scene, so I was surprised by how many people use it. After doing some reading about it, I came to the conclusion that LMMS is sort of the black sheep of the audio workstation world, but instead of that being a bad thing like Batman and Robin, it's more like Halloween 3. It goes off and does its own thing, and actually innovates and succeeds where others have failed. Opinions from content creators and producers about it range from it being the most confusing DAW ever all the way to being God's gift to mankind. To me, it's sort of somewhere in between because its layout is somewhat similar to FL Studio, which made it easier for me to grasp as a newcomer. LMMS, previously known as Linux MultiMedia Studio, is a digital audio workstation that's open source, much like Audacity, which we covered in a previous video. The interesting thing here is that there's less than a grain of sand's worth of information about its history on the internet, so we kind of had to Sherlock Holmes this one to cobble together a somewhat cohesive timeline. I can't pronounce his name properly, but from what I could tell, it was originally created by Tobias Junguns, but has since been developed by a bunch of different people. Unsurprisingly, this guy is basically a ghost online outside of a bare LinkedIn profile and his GitHub page, so I don't have much information on him. Sadly, his last contribution to LMMS was in 2018 according to the GitHub changelogs. I did ask the LMMS Discord server, which we'll talk about later, if Tobias still worked on the project, and most of the members there said no. Finally, I did hunt down his email address and shot him an email in the hopes that maybe he'd respond and answer some questions, but sadly there was no luck with that. That's pretty much the only information I could find about the origins of LMMS, so let's get into its early versions and why I think it deserves more attention than it gets. First off, it was created under the GPL2 or General Public License. When a piece of software is released under this license, it guarantees end users the 4 freedoms laid out by the license, which are to run, study, share, and modify the software as they please. I think this is the core of what makes LMMS unique because there's an extremely limited number of DAWs that are open source and free to use like this. There's a very active development community surrounding it, and it's receiving updates at a rate far faster than any other commercially available DAW out there. From what I could tell, the first version was 0.0.1, released in 2004 when the software name was still Linux Multimedia Studio instead of the shortened version LMMS. Sadly, I couldn't even find screenshots, let alone video of this version. I did try installing them because LMMS hosts every single major version change online, but sadly it gave errors on startup similar to version 1 of Fruity Loops. It's unclear what types of features they had because the versions uploaded to GitHub have no documentation and I couldn't open them myself. So if anyone has screenshots or used the program back then, please comment below because tracking down info about these early versions would be really interesting. Anyways, moving on to the versions that have some info about them, we'll be skipping ahead a few years. By version 0.3.0, you could see LMMS forming into a truly functional DAW. It actually feels quite similar to FL Studio with the separation of patterns and a step sequencer for your drums that can also host MIDI patterns. Its layout and style is very early 2000s, and all of its elements are disconnected and free-floating like FL Studio's, which I'm personally a fan of. The piano roll even looks like you're entering the Matrix or something like that. This would also be the time period where support for VST effect plugins was added, which was a huge deal because of how popular VST was becoming during the time period. We'd also see a few new plugins native to LMMS like LB302, which was a monophonic bass synth. Mallets would also be introduced, which was described as a sample-based synth emulating tuneful things to bang on. Some other minor things would be fixed and added, like note detuning or improved automation, but for the most part, it was still finding its place amongst a sea of other DAWs. In 0.4, there was even a mixer added with an effect chain on each insert. A big change here was the fact that all parameters could now be controlled with an LFO or MIDI controller that were housed in a new controller window. New plugins would continue to come in every major version, with 0.4 bringing in chiptune-based plugins with the addition of SID and PAPU. I couldn't find much info on PAPU, but it seemed like it was a plugin meant to emulate the hardware of a Nintendo Game Boy. Time signatures outside the basic 4/4 signature were now possible as well in version 0.4. After reading about all these different DAWs and their development journey, it's actually quite interesting how different people go down different paths, adding things in a far different order. However, with the most recent versions of all these programs, they'll all end up in a place where most of them can do anything you want, just in their own unique way. The piano roll would also get a nice upgrade here with more options for individual notes like panning, and became easier to work with when selecting multiple notes and moving them around. Later on in 0.4, it'd finally be possible to automate parameters of VSTs. However, most of these updates were fairly small in scale in comparison to what was coming next. 10 years after its initial release, version 1.0 would finally come out in March of 2014 with a massive array of changes and updates. Firstly, the interface would get a makeover, becoming a bit more polished and modern, but keeping its original 2000s style. On the plugin side of things, we'd see a wave shaper much like the one in FL Studio, which is one of my personal favorite types of effect. One of the more well-known plugins also came in this version, which is called Opulence, which is an FM synth. Something I noticed early on is how cohesive all the plugins look, not only in size but in art style. It's something that's kind of bugged me with FL Studio, where plugins from different eras of the software look vastly different from each other, but in LMMS, they've kept it relatively simple and 2D. Throughout version 1, there was a bunch of quality of life updates like vector-based automation, custom waveforms for LFOs, and timeline improvements. Version 1.1 would add a few new instruments as well, including Nescaline, which is probably the coolest thing I've ever seen come stock with a DAW. It's a synthesizer modeled after the Nintendo Entertainment System's hardware, emulating all the different sounds that it makes, and it even looks like an NES controller, which is just the cherry on top. Watson would also be added here as well, which is a wavetable synth like Serum, except it's extremely condensed. We'd also see mixer chaining and routing added here as well, allowing for an unlimited amount of effect channels. And in version 1.2, we'd see a classic plugin added, which was a visualized parametric EQ, along with a few different effects like a bit crusher. Sadly, this is where the LMMS journey ends for now, as version 1.2 is the latest stable release, although there is version 1.3 available to try, which is an alpha. However, before we conclude, there are a few other things I'd like to talk about that aren't directly related to the program itself. GitHub might be the single greatest resource that I had at my disposal writing this script, however short it is, and I wish more companies would host previous versions and documentation online for its users to explore. ImageLine does host its older versions on a forum and has a history section on their site, but outside that, it's pretty hard to find old versions of different software in the music industry, let alone from a first-party source. If you ever want to see what old versions of LMS looked like yourself, you can download them for free and peruse at your own pace. Not only that, but you can see in detail how the program evolved over time with a pretty in-depth amount of changelogs for each version, on top of being able to see how many different collaborators there are working on the project. This is something that I find to be the most interesting thing about LMMS. It's not created by a big company, and it doesn't cost money because it's a passion project for the people who develop it. This is the same reason I think Audacity is one of the most important programs of its time, and still is to this day. Anyways, thank God the developers placed everything on GitHub, otherwise I'm not sure this video would have even been possible. Moving on to the final section of this video, the LMMS community. So aside from LMMS being open source, the other thing I find interesting about it is the community that surrounds it, specifically the subreddit and Discord server. The subreddit is not exactly the most active, but for being as small as it is, there's still multiple posts every day. On the other hand, the LMS Discord server is one of the most tight-knit and active communities I've ever seen when it comes to music. They're just shy of 7,000 members on the server, with anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people online at any time, which was shocking to me considering I'd never heard of the program before. The best thing about the server though is the fact that people have direct contact with the people who develop the program, so they can report bugs, suggest features, or simply talk about what they enjoy. In fact, the other day while I was on the server just lurking, someone discovered the default equalizer in LMMS had been bugged ever since its release over 15 years ago and was being worked on right in front of my eyes. Some members even provided me with extremely old screenshots of LMMS to help with my video, so I'll leave a link to the Discord server if you're interested in joining, but that just about wraps up everything. If there's anything you learned from this video, I hope it's that there are always going to be cool new things to discover online in whatever community you're a part of, and it's worth looking a bit deeper into those things. LMMS is definitely the most unique DAW I've written a script about, so if you have any other weird or intriguing software you want me to talk about, please leave a comment below. I know the video was short, but I hope you guys enjoyed it anyway. Thank you guys for watching, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video.